Good morning. Welcome to the USJI seminars on maritime security, legislation, and China, Japan, Korea project. I'm Kazuichi Uchida, president of this USJI, and also vice president of Waseda University. The USJI, US-Japan Research Institute, was established in March 2009 by the leading Japanese, by 8 leading Japanese universities, namely Dosha, Keio, Kyoto, Ritsumeikan, Tsukuba, Tokyo, Waseda universities. And we are financially supported by Japanese corporations and also the foundations in the United States. And our mission is to encourage and to dispatch the policy-related issues on the global topics both US and Japan faced. And we have continuously held USJI week twice a year, March and in September as well. And this time, there are 8 different events. We covered such topics as energy, food, climate change, disaster resilience, issues concerning the Korean Peninsula, and the relationship of the US, Japan, China, and Korea. And today's event is the 7th event of this week. And before introducing today's moderator, Professor Terada, I would like to ask the participants for the permission of taking your photos or pictures for the video recording. And I would like to welcome the Professor Terada.
Thank you very much, Professor Uchida. Again, those who are kindly coming back today after joining the yesterday's seminar, welcome back. And we just joined today. Thank you very much for gathering for this seminar this morning. It's sort of a repetition that I mentioned yesterday, but again, I tried to change a little bit. The lineup of the team was very different, and the theme was also very different as well. Well, as I mentioned yesterday, our seminar topic, jointly organized by USJI and also Waseda Organization for US-Japan Relations, is sort of counterpart to Waseda University of USJI, has sort of set up a seminar. It's sort of a long-term seminar starting sometime last year, taking advantage of the different opportunities at the time, more focusing on the one specific issue. This is CJK, China, Japan, Korea. And we have 3 major variables which must be used for analyzing the trends and phenomena which have been going on in Northeast Asia. So I believe it may be useful for some American scholars or people, journalists, who may be interested in what's going on in Northeast Asia. And number 1, again, this is very similar to yesterday's explanations. For East Asia, particularly Northeast Asia, regional integration in both trade investment as well as the financial cooperation have been rapidly developed. And finally, regional integration negotiation in Northeast Asia by China, Japan, Korea started, actually just started a couple of weeks ago. And on the other hand, looking at bilaterally, the China-Japan relationship, Korea-Japan relationship, even Korea-China relationship sometimes is strained by sort of historical interpretation differences or territorial disputes, or even people's the uncomfortable interaction. For example, the anti-Japanese movement in China have been much more reported in Japan, and the Japanese public tried to respond to it. Sort of the aggravation of the violent relationship was so much higher because of that. So in this case, we have a very different trend which could be identified in terms of Northeast Asian relations, very cooperative towards single market, for example. And on the other hand, bilaterally speaking, a number of tensions, disputations, etc. So how we can try to catch or characterize these trends in the Northeast Asia? This is our major theme. And we continue to even have seminars and working groups and etc., even going back to Tokyo. And probably, hopefully, we're coming back here with a different, panels or even different information, etc. And second variable is change of governments. Again, I asked yesterday the panelists to touch on the implications of the changing government in 3 nations. Particularly, Mr. Abe, who was here last week, had a tremendous impact already on the Japanese fiscal policy, for example. If exchange rate has been dramatically changed. And how about security and defense areas? This is something which he tried to push very hard when he was in power 6 years ago. Unfortunately, he left his prime minister after just 1 year. So in this case, he must be feeling frustrated by sort of the failure to realize what he wants to do in terms of defense and security issues, especially in terms of strengthening the US-Japan alliance system. So this is probably a significant area, but probably the change of the Korean government. Ms. Park was just inaugurated this week, and also the change of government in China. So what kind of policy implications, particularly in terms of defense security issues, can be identified through this is probably the second important issue, those variables I have to say, what we have to focus on. And finally, yes, Asian people. Many Asian people, countries, and government officials developed a keener interest in what's going on after Mr. Obama won the election second time. Even change of the senior officers in charge of this Asia and Pacific should have a huge impact on the American Asian people policies. And as I mentioned before, the regional integration is sort of discrimination. So market integration naturally discriminates against the United States, despite the fact that Korea and Japan are key allies of the US in those situations. So how we have to explain this kind of the policy implications? Well, again, this is just a few to say, but we have many more significant issues. And I simply want to leave all panelists here to say, in line with what I just described. Of course, some of you may disagree with what I said here, but that's fine. So let me introduce 3 distinguished panelists today. So I'm very pleased and honored to have these 3 people today this morning. First of all, Chikako Ueki, a professor of Graduate School of International Asia-Pacific Studies at the Tokyo Waseda University. And Chikako is currently joining her sabbatical and Boston, back to the Haramoto MIT. And she's just flying early this morning to Washington, D.C. And Dr. Mark Min, and specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Services. And Mark has been written quite widely on the Asia-Pacific matters, especially China, Korea, and Japan. And Mark's most recent paper on Senkaku issue has been widely covered by Japanese media. So, and I really appreciate he making sort of some comments on sort of the Senkaku dispute as well. And sub-speaker, Dr. Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for the Korean Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Scott is well known in Washington, D.C. as a Korean specialist, especially his writing on Korea-US relationship has been also well acknowledged and also quoted by many scholars, including us. So all of them actually have been involved in the sort of project with myself. So I'm quite happy to be listening to those speakers' comments, and I hope you have a wonderful morning. And yes, and Q&As by audiences, they always welcome. So we try to open the Q&A after these three speakers' presentations. So let me introduce first speaker, Professor Ricky.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I apologize for my voice. It's cracking up, and I hope you'll be able to hear me in between the coughs. Professor Terada, thank you very much for your introduction, and I am very happy and delighted to be given this opportunity to talk to you this morning, and I notice familiar faces of my former students as well here. I'm very happy to see you and some new faces as well. So today I would like to talk about some of the things that Professor Terada had mentioned. The title of the talk is Times of Change, What is at Stake, Security Situation in East Asia. The questions that I'm raising here is, can we maintain the long peace? And I have to explain slightly what I'm talking about. 2 years ago, we started this project on long peace in Northeast Asia, together with Professor Terada and other members from Waseda and outside of Waseda. And we published the book last year, and the book is in Japanese. It's called Long Peace in Northeast Asia, War Avoided. The question we raised was many of the sort of the wisdom, as it were, or international relations theory would tell us that there would be more transition of power, nuclear weapon states, not stable democracies altogether. We have North Korea and China who are not democracies, and also historical animosities, and the countries have still not overcome the wars that happened more than 60 years ago. So from all that, we should expect perhaps more conflict, but the region has enjoyed as long a peace as the European countries, which we might expect there to be more peace. So we started off looking at some crises that did not develop into war, and so my question here refers to that. So can we maintain the long peace? So we looked at the factors that contributed to the de-escalation of the conflicts that happened through this during the 60 years, and then the question, the important question that we need to ask now is this going to continue, and what are changing? So I'd like to touch on that, and also I'd like to talk about what is really at stake here. And since I was given the task of maritime security issues, then we need to think what is actually being contested. Is it just the islands, or is it something more? So what is at stake here? And then the new leaders, what are the implications, and what are the challenges that leaders face? And as a closing, things to keep in mind. So I'm not really going to offer any answers, but I would like to raise questions so that we could think about them together. So factors for long peace. There are several factors, and I'm just going to touch upon one of them, which is not anything surprising, but was the cost-benefit calculation, cost-benefit analysis favored peace. Basically, cost of waging a war or escalating the conflict was much more than the benefit gained from that, which might be rather simple, but all of the crises that we looked at, many of this had that trait. So what are the costs? It could be military costs, meaning that if you cannot achieve something and if you are damaged militarily, that's a cost. Political cost, meaning a diplomatic cost, and economic and domestic political cost. These were the costs, and there was some opportunity cost we needed to think about. Opportunity cost of not escalating the conflict. So what would be the opportunity cost of not taking more aggressive action? And the benefit is basically achieving the objective. So cost-benefit analysis in the past. Interestingly, we identified that the offshore island case was one of the cases that were the cost-benefit calculation was slightly difficult, and the deterrence perhaps might be more difficult, which might be counterintuitive in some sense, because it is a small case skirmish or conflict, even if it does lead to a conflict and something like an outright aggression by, for example, North Korea to the south, or bigger scale aggression might require more capabilities and will to deter. But what we found was that because what is at stake seems to be rather small, there was some doubt that it could not, the countries involved may not act to defend them, meaning that US may not intervene as readily as to say, for example, Tokyo, for example. So the deterrence capability was slightly assessed as less than an outright aggression cases. So we looked at the offshore island case as one of the cases, and the Senkaku Island is one of them. So in the past, and I'm looking at past as during the Cold War as well as after the Cold War, but militarily Japan and the US were overwhelmingly strong, meaning that, and I'm here, I'm sorry to be going back and forth, but because status quo is that Japan has the control over the islands, the challenger to the status quo would have to be China or Taiwan. So if there was a party that needs to initiate an escalation of the crisis, it has to start from the North status quo party, China in this case. So militarily, Japan and US were overwhelmingly powerful, meaning that the cost of escalating to a conflict is extremely high for China for a long time. Of course, China embarked on its military modernization in 1985, and also after the Gulf War in 1990, but nevertheless there is a large gap, although it is becoming smaller. Now politically, during the Cold War, Japan, China, US were quasi-allies against the Soviet threat. So whatever there might be an issue between the two bilaterally, between Japan and China, it was not in the interest of China to escalate that, because there were negative consequences of a bigger thing. For example, Deng Xiaoping had said in a summit meeting, as well as in a press conference in Tokyo, that the issue of violence could be left to the later generations. So there was that happening. Economically, Japan gave a lot of aid to, official aid to China. Trade-wise, China benefited from the trade, also the technological transfers, and I think Japan was one of the strongest advocates of China's accession to WTO. For decades, China's strategy has been, and I think it still is to make China economically affluent and therefore politically stable and friendly to Japan. I think Japan has been very successful in realizing the first. I'm sure the Chinese people, of course, did most of the work, but nevertheless, we are now enjoying China becoming economically affluent and growing and thriving economy. Political stability, maybe more so than the past, but not quite unfriendly to Japan. I think we are rather failing in that regard. But these were some of the tools and some of the benefits that were gained by maintaining the status quo and not escalating the conflict. Opportunity cost of not acting, meaning that opportunity cost of China not really contesting and escalating the conflict or initiating the conflict, was relatively small because Senkaku Island issue was not really politically so important in the domestic discourse in China. And I think until more recently, I think Taiwan was much a bigger issue, and the Senkaku issue has been, I think, elevated in the, as a nationalism symbol more recently. Benefit is the seizure of the islands, which is probably the same. So that's the present. So militarily, Japan and the US, I would say, is still very strong. And although there have been some concerns in this town, as well as in Japan, that access to the periphery of China might be more difficult or more costly than before, meaning that, for example, for the US carrier battle groups to enter the sea near China might be more costly, meaning that they have a way of denying that. I don't think China has that capability yet, but if you do the cost benefit, before there was relatively no, well, basically no cost, but now you do have to think of the cost. So although it's still strong, I think it is more costly than before. Politically, there are no what I call strategic safety net, meaning that there is no security benefit that the three countries share in trying to counter a common enemy. So there is no political, in the sense of a security political benefit or cost of reneging that environment. Economically, there is virtually no aid. There are some human resource aid still from Japan to China, but comparatively there's much less aid. Trade, it's thriving, but it's a two-way, so it's not really only Japan or the US leverage vis-a-vis China, so it goes both ways. No need for introduction, meaning that you don't really need US or Japan doesn't really have to introduce China to the world. China is already strong and important country, so it doesn't really need that. Well, meaning that even if the relations were severe, China could be less hurt. Opportunity of course not acting, I would say, is much higher domestically for the reasons that I said it before, that it's now a major issue in the Chinese public debate. So not acting on it would be costly to the leadership. So benefit again is seizure of the islands, but then I'll come back to what the benefit of that might be. Increasing the cost. So if we are to maintain peace and avoid conflict, obviously we have to increase the cost of initiating or escalating the conflict. So militarily, Japan and US, I think increasing credibility is important. As I said, because the islands are basically not a great real estate asset, although it has importance, obviously, and it's a sovereignty issue, so it's extremely important, but it's not Tokyo, basically. So if there are any doubts of US not intervening, and the Article 5 of the US-Japan Treaty not to be put into effect, that could lower expected cost of escalation. So increasing the credibility is extremely important, and I think recently the United States government has been doing this repeatedly. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had mentioned this several times, and even after the second term of the Obama administration, this has been the message coming out from the United States. Politically, I think here is what is probably lacking, and I would probably say a bit more in the closing remarks, but this need for security incentives, I think, is lacking. I think it is important for China to be able to see that there is a benefit on not escalating. And I'm not sure if US or Japan are able to offer this at this point in time. Economic number 8, opportunity cost of domestically high is, I think, increasingly high. Just very quickly, how the current situation with China-Japan relations, you could see that many people think of it as not good, and the red line is really shooting up. It shot up in 2010 when there was an incident near Senkaku Islands with the fishermen boats, and then again in 2012 it's really shooting up. This is the sort of the affinity towards China is sort of showing the same thing. This is to just make it in relative to other countries. The US is in the blue line. You could see that it's really high. Affinity towards US is up in the 80s or more than that. Unfortunately, Japanese affinity towards South Korea is went down. This again is to do with Takeshima issue, and I think Scott will probably address this. I'm not going to. And Russia has always been rather unfavored, but you can see that now China is less favored than Japan. So what is at stake? Okay. So what is at stake? Is it just the islands? Or is it test of resolve? Is it beginning of an expansion? Is it, I don't have it here, but is it the sort of two concepts of how the maritime should be? One is the global commons idea that the United States have put forward since the last quadrennial defense review. This is a concept that the global commons, meaning the commons of the sea and the airspace and even the space above it, is accessible to all. But the fact that US is the primary power and the hegemon is that it has control over these global commons. So it has the ability to provide it to anybody who wants to access it, but it has the capability to deny access to that as well, which decreases the cost of intervention. So this is the global commons idea, and the Obama administration has put on a much more sort of a world community spin to this global commons idea, and the opposing idea might be the enclosure of the sea idea. So is that the two concepts about that? So the first scenario could be de-escalation, compromise, leading to cooperation. So, but the second scenario could be compromise, leading to more demand. And I'm not going to be, I'm not capable of answering this question, but it could set a precedent on the Chinese government. And let me just walk you through what I mean is that if China sees this as that they're putting pressure on Japan by sending maritime surveillance ships and some government agency ships, the agricultural, fishery, and maritime agencies, etc. If it is seen that these behavior achieve some success, then if the next time around, and even the Chinese leadership wanted to compromise, it may not be able to do so because the public might think that, and might demand the government saying, it worked the last time, one is, why aren't you doing it again? So this would basically make the Chinese leadership response very, very inflexible. So we have to think what is at stake. I only have 1 minute, new leaders. Abe is not quite a brand new leader, which might work in favor of him, meaning that he doesn't really have to prove himself as much as a brand new leader. I call it nationalist paradox, meaning that he is known as a nationalist, so he doesn't really have to prove himself as being nationalist. So he might be able to pay the price of being more conciliatory. His approval rating is now more than 70%. For the 3 consecutive surveys, he gained about 8 points consecutively. Just one word, things to keep in mind. So what's really is important is how to deter negative behavior while encouraging cooperation. I think pivot is extremely important because it shows that some of the negative behavior cannot be tolerated. But we really need more than just deterrence. Positive inducements are important. Institutional building is important. The United States and Japan can cooperate in institution building. I don't think the 2 countries have been able to do that very effectively, but those things are important. So with that, I went a little bit too long, but okay. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vixen. Well, using the harm concept and for explaining the long peace in Northeast Asia, for Project Peace, I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Yes, we just finished it, and the book was just published, and I'm sure Vixen has plenty of the copies. If you like, you just ask her to present to you. One question, just like yesterday's. I actually try to use more, of course, use concept to explain the peace, but realist and liberalist. But particularly in explaining the peace in Northeast Asia is a bit difficult because we have a couple of the potential threats, and the threats also different to different countries. So and these factors are always, the confusing and also making it very hard to use the one single theory to explain that. For example, Vixen used the economics, the approaches, which might be probably useful for hampering both nations from taking sort of the incentive to attack each other. Interdependence, for example, growing trade, and is it the factor, for example, China to consider in preventing itself from attacking Japan? But on the other hand, in terms of the US-China relationships, of course, trade interdependence is very significant. But on the other hand, China is the largest holder of US state and national bonds. And again, this is the very first time for the United States to have the largest trading partner, well, except of course, the Canada, Mexico, but also the largest holder of the national bonds, while China is considered to be a threat or enemy, China. So and how we have to, in a sense, conceptualize such kind of economic independence in a different field in explaining the Chinese and Japanese and American approach to China, particularly provide sort of the deterrence to China. So if you touched on that, that would be very much appreciated. Maybe you can answer after your presentations. Okay, second speaker, Mark, and you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Terada-sensei. And this being a Japanese sponsored forum, I should start my talk by an apology to the people right in front of us sitting here. I think all three of us are dealing with some colds and other things, so I'm sorry for the germs spreading here. And if my voice fails me, you'll forgive me. Sorry about that. I should also start out with a disclaimer that because I work for a government agency, I should say that the views I'm going to express don't represent those of my organization, the Congressional Research Service, and they also don't represent the views of all 535 members of Congress and the thousands of staff who are my bosses. So the blame goes on me. And Tada-sensei, you kindly mentioned some of the reports that I've been involved in dealing with senkakus and other Asia-related, Asia-wide events. And I should say that those are very much, most of those, in fact, almost all of them are I work with other colleagues on those. So I can't get all the credit for that, for those. The good parts are mine, the bad parts are his. So let me start off by just saying a few words about the pivot, since that was one of the assignments that Tada-sensei gave me. Last summer, Scott and I sort of did a bit of a quick grand tour around Southeast Asia and Australia to talk about attitudes towards the pivot and to listen to people and get their impressions. And I have to say many of the questions that were being asked are still relevant today. And she said, I mean, the questions were how sustainable. Well, one question was, is it too military focused? And that certainly still remains the question today as well. Another big question that was being asked was, how sustainable will it be? And there were several strands of this. One of them was, could the U.S. get its fiscal house and financial house in order? And at the time, I was sort of reassuring people saying, don't worry about the sequestration thing because it's designed to be so big that there's no way it could come into play. Anyway, don't listen to me, in other words. I don't know what I'm talking about in that point. But obviously, what's going on now, financially and fiscally, at least in the short term, raises questions about how, or just continues these questions about how sustainable U.S. presence in Asia and the pivot will be, particularly on the military side, but also in terms of how the U.S. will be able to shift resources on the civilian side, if you will, the overseas assistance, for example, moving personnel in the State Department into Asia. All these things are obviously dependent upon having adequate budgetary resources to do that. The second set of sustainability questions had to do with personnel. And given that we have new leadership, at least at the cabinet and sub-cabinet levels, I think those questions remain. Clearly, a lot of the pivot, particularly on the civilian side, was due to the leadership of former Secretary Clinton and Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell. They're both gone, and it remains a question as to how aggressively their successors will continue pushing the pivot in all its aspects. I will say that, however, as I'll talk in more detail in a moment, that despite these changes in personnel, U.S. interests in Asia are not going to change, and in fact might get even stronger depending on how events go. So, and one of the hallmarks of the first Obama administration is by increasing U.S. involvement in more organizations like the East Asia Summit, forming the U.S.-ASEAN Summit, creating all sorts of new dialogues with various partners across Asia. It, in a way, it locks the U.S. into, at least physically, diplomatically, on the diplomatic side, a greater presence in Asia. Or to put it another way, it raises the costs, if you will. If the U.S. doesn't send the Secretary of State to the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting, for example, or if the President does not go to an East Asia Summit, the cost will certainly be higher because the bar has been raised. So in that sense, I think it's been raised sufficiently, and because we have mostly a continuity in administrations, we don't have to worry on that front. TPP is still going forward, although there will be questions as to how will the U.S. and other countries have an ability to actually reach an agreement? But that was always going to be difficult. and time will tell, probably in the next 2 to 3 years or so. Let me turn now to maritime disputes, and since that's another sort of sub-theme of our topic today. And I'm just going to sort of make a bunch of random observations. Some of them will be related, others won't be. First off, I'll just rank the various disputes in Northeast Asia. There's a hierarchy, at least in the American mind. Not surprisingly, the first one, I think by anyone's measure, is the Senkaku-Diaoyu dispute. Clearly, that's the most important, and I'll talk in more detail about that in a minute. The second dispute, though, is actually not in Northeast Asia, and that's the South China Sea dispute. And ironically, as I'll talk more in a minute, but I think this is Americans are watching what's going on in the South China Sea because of its relation to the Senkaku. So that is arguably the number 2 most important one. Both of these are about China, and in both of them, the U.S. is not neutral. Although it is neutral on the territorial disputes, it's not strictly neutral in terms of whose side the U.S. is taking. Third is the Dokdo-Takeshima dispute, which, as I think it's no secret to you, the U.S. Views strictly as a bilateral one. It wants to stay out of it as much as possible, and frankly, many Americans view it more as a nuisance than anything else. And I apologize to any South Koreans in the room for saying that. And then lastly is the Kurils, Northern Territories dispute between Japan and Russia. So I'm not going to say too much. I don't think I'm going to have time about Dokdo-Takeshima. Again, if Scott has time, he may talk about those if you have questions. I'll also leave the Kurils, Northern Territories, to questions as well. So, U.S. interests. As I said before, these are interests that are not going to change, regardless of who's in the White House or the State Department or the Pentagon. What are they in the maritime disputes? The first one, and here's a direct linkage between what Tadada-sensei has talked about, sort of the economic Asia and security Asia, and that's protecting unimpeded commerce along some of the world's busiest maritime trade routes, particularly the Straits of Malacca. So, the primary U.S. interest in Asia, I believe, is economic, or at least the economics and trade drives so much of why the U.S. cares about Asia. Excuse me. And a big part of this is avoiding any attempts by any parties in the region to intimidate U.S. companies which seek to operate in the region. Secondly, maintaining peace and stability among maritime nations. So the U.S. has spoken pretty consistently about opposing any coercion, intimidation, or threats or use of force here. And we've seen this most recently in U.S. statements over the Senkakus, but of course also on the South China Sea as well. Thirdly, encouraging rules-based norms that, as I said before, discourage coercion or the use of force. The Obama administration and former Secretary Clinton were particularly forceful on this, and this philosophy of trying to do more to influence the norms and rules and shape the norms and rules of Asia really underpin the philosophy behind, or the rationale behind the rebalancing or the pivot. Fourth, protecting the U.S. Navy's ability to operate in these areas, to sort of provide the security underpinning that makes all the rest possible. And fifth, maintaining credibility of U.S. treaty alliances with the nations involved in these disputes. And as I'll talk more in a minute, some of these interests can conflict. Now, some would argue that protecting these interests involves protecting any hegemon from arising in Asia. We saw this in play in the 30s and 40s with Japan, and now this is at play, of course, in contemplating what China's rise may mean in the future. And some would even go farther in saying that protecting these interests involves the U.S. involves the U.S. seeking to retain primacy in the region. And you know, back last summer when Scott and I were doing our sort of grand tour, of course, there were many questions about the U.S. presidential election, and one of the things that I was arguing is that this question of primacy was, well, there was a lot of commonality on Asia policy between the Obama and Romney approach, or likely Romney approaches, that this question of primacy was probably one difference in that a Romney administration is more likely to push for retaining U.S. primacy in several aspects, but particularly militarily. How am I doing on time? Yeah. Okay, second set of observations. As I said, all eyes are on the Senkakus, first of all, most important dispute, as I said before. And this is primarily because, well, one thing, of course, it's involving the region's two largest countries, two largest militaries, two largest economies, but also, maybe even more importantly, is it involves the U.S. and China much more directly than any of the other disputes. And I think, you know, as has been written in many different places, really one of the conclusions that Scott and I reached after our trip, I think it's safe to say, is that the biggest sort of policy recommendation or implication, if you will, that we came away with was the importance of getting the U.S.-China relationship right. And so if the Senkakus does not go well for some reason, it could cascade and affect the bilateral Sino-U.S. relationship, and that could affect everything else. Second observation is that because of this linkage between the U.S. and China over the Senkakus, the South China Sea and the Senkakus have effectively become linked, certainly in the eyes of American policymakers, but also Chinese policymakers and policymakers around the region. I was struck, last summer I spent the summer in Japan and took time out to fly around with Scott for a bit. And I was struck by the number of times people in various places were referring to the other disputes. Southeast Asians saying how closely they were watching U.S. policy on the Senkakus, Japanese saying the same thing about the South China Sea. The Chinese view, of course, is that the U.S. moves basically since 2010 when Hillary Clinton spoke out at the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting saying that the U.S. has a national interest in freedom of navigation, and she was referring, of course, to the South China Sea. The Chinese view has been that this is unwarranted interference, and it's part of just a U.S.-led policy of containing China's ambitions. And it's unclear to what extent the change in China's I'm not a China expert, I should say, but I can say that it's unclear as to what the leadership change, what difference that will make, although Xi Jinping's reported or suspected involvement in the Senkakus and South China Sea policies doesn't necessarily lead one to be optimistic on that front. I will say that, you know, one thing that many Chinese will say is that the rebalancing or the pivot has acted to embolden or enable U.S. allies to be more aggressive and provocative than, from the Chinese point of view, than they otherwise would have been. And this is sort of the flip side of Ueki-san's equation here, which is, while yes, the U.S.-Japan treaty can provide credibility, but there's also the entanglement problem, at least from the U.S. point of view, and of course from the Chinese point of view, is it emboldening people or countries to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. This was the feeling of a lot of people in the case of the Philippines with regards to the Scarborough Shoal incident last year. And there are people who are worried that if the U.S. Reacts too strongly on the Senkakus issue, that it might encourage the Japanese government to do something that it might not otherwise do. for example, stationing people on the Senkakus. Okay, third, so this is a challenge for the rebalancing effort as well. How does the U.S. strike the right balance between providing just enough credibility, but not too much? Third observation is that while in all four of the disagreements I mentioned earlier, the U.S. takes no position on the territorial disputes. Of course, the U.S. is the least neutral and the least ambiguous on the Senkakus. I don't think I need to go over, the treaty obligations that the U.S. has there, but I will note that the trend line is for the U.S. to drop its ambiguity, and that because the feeling is China's becoming more aggressive, and that's putting the U.S. in a position where it needs to be more emphatic about its support of Japan. Congress, I have to give a cheer for Congress. Congress acted first on this front last fall by passing legislation that included some language stating that the U.S., or at least Congress, regarded the unilateral actions by any third party, i.e. China, would not affect the United States acknowledgement that the Senkakus are administered by the Senkakus, and this was later picked up by Secretary Clinton in her meeting with Foreign Minister Kishida last month, or I'm sorry, in January. Let's see, I could say more on that point, but I think I better move on in the interest of time. Finally, my last point is that Senkakus are unique not only because it's the least ambiguous policy for the U.S., but also because the stakes are so much higher. I think it's a pretty self-evident point. As I said before, the challenge for the U.S. is to find that Goldilocks point, providing enough credibility without encouraging sort of the hardline forces in Japan to go too far, because the U.S. wants to avoid being drawn into a potential conflict. And so far, the backing has been very, very strong for Japan here in D.C. on the Senkakus issue. And this is because the problem is being seen mainly as one that's being pushed by China rather than the fault of Japanese actions. But if push comes to shove, and there is some sort of military conflict between Japan and China, I think that sort of open-ended support for Japan could be called into question, particularly by some, not necessarily within the whatever administration's in power, but perhaps in Congress and in the broader American public. And this will be particularly the case if there's a feeling that Japan has not at least tested multiple options, particularly diplomatic options. And so I think the Japanese government has to think carefully on two fronts. A, whether they want to explore other more creative solutions, particularly if the current crisis calms down a bit. I don't know if that means recognizing that there's a dispute or doing something like that, but some sort of creative option that at least tests China's willingness to actually step back in the medium term. And then secondly, I think the Japanese government would do well to wage a public diplomacy battle that isn't simply reiterating its positions one after another. And I think Prime Minister Abe's remarks last week when he was here that, look, Japan, we're going to defend ourselves and we're not necessarily going to call on the U.S. as a first resort. I think that's a good first step in that line because the U.S. above all wants to have a strong Japan, and to the extent that there's an image of Japan as being willing to take it to the first line of defense as is called for in various alliance statements will go a long way to reassuring people here who might call into question U.S. policy on the Senkakus and whether it's going too far and thereby actually encouraging or creating the conditions for conflict rather than the opposite. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for very comprehensive presentations touching on the all key elements related to the disputes, not only Northeast Asia but also Southeast Asia as well. And I like for introducing the sort of the constellation of the ingredients to quite clearly the US-Asia pivot. And my question comes from one of the assumptions linkage between Senkaku and South China Sea disputes, particularly American approaches. When it comes to South China Sea, I think the Americans' engagement was quite strong and clear. Using multilateral forums like ARF or East Asian Forum, I think the major impetus for US engagement in EAS, for example, in 2011, was mainly related to the creating so-called coalition building with like minor countries to pressure on China, and also military exercises. And just the US started with Vietnam, and of course more vigorously with the Philippines bilaterally, and even involving Australia and as well as Japan to make a military exercise an offshore of Brunei in the South China Sea. And finally, US tried to improve the sort of the would-be friendly nature of China in South China Sea, Myanmar. But again, multilateral forums in Northeast Asia, military exercises, as well as the improving the former friendly relations, China, which is North Korea. It seems to me the US didn't so much in terms of the Northeast Asia or Senkaku. So how you can explain these kind of quite different approaches the US has been taking to this, to maritime and a dispute, despite your assertion of relevance or relations between them? This is my question. Okay, finally, my third speaker, Scott. Yes, please.
Well, first, let me thank Dorado-san and USJI for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's my second opportunity to participate in USJI Week, and I think it's really a nice additional feature of our dialogue here in Washington. Since Mark started off with an apology, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a joke about the pivot, and that is based on my observations this week. I think that the U.S. government has really been doing a bad job of explaining the pivot, because here we saw Dennis Rodman in Pyongyang meeting with Kim Jong-un, and I don't know if it's because if the mistake in understanding is that Dennis Rodman thinks that he can be a diplomat, or that Kim Jong-un thinks that the pivot could be a way to improve his relationship with the United States. So we'll have to wait and see what the answer is on that. But what I wanted to do is to cover three areas. One, kind of what does the pivot mean for Northeast Asia? Secondly, what is the leadership transition in South Korea? What is its significance for regional relations? And the third area I wanted to look at a little bit is the prospects and limitations for U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateralism. And I think that it's very interesting to think about the pivot in the context of Northeast Asia, actually, because when you really look at what has been happening, a lot of the central focus of action has really been on trying to reinforce U.S. relationships in Southeast Asia as we think of the challenges related to China from a broader aperture than has traditionally been the case as we look at Northeast Asia. And so what I think that has meant actually for our allies in Northeast Asia is that actually the pivot hasn't been really much of a big deal, because it really assumes stasis in Northeast Asia. It actually assumes that things aren't really going to change very much in Northeast Asia. But that, I think, that assumption has turned out to be problematic, because actually for the first time, in recent memory at least, we actually have two situations involving increasing tensions in Northeast Asia at the same time. The Senkakus and North Korea with its nuclear test. And so this is really, I think, a big challenge potentially for any kind of intent behind rebalancing, because the assumption of stability in Northeast Asia or stasis, if it proves to be incorrect, and in fact, if we see that there's the need for greater attention in Northeast Asia, it actually upends potentially the idea of extending to Southeast Asia, and it creates a bigger challenge, I think, for the United States, especially as related to providing reassurance to Japan and South Korea related to the sustainability of its security commitments. And so that's the reason why it's kind of a challenge, and that's what I have been seeing, especially as I look at South Korean responses to the pivot, and I think to a certain extent, some of the Japanese responses to the pivot. So in South Korea, what I hear is that the United States wants to be in Asia, and that South Korea is positive about the fact that the U.S. wants to be active in Asia, and they're fine with the idea of the U.S. presence serving as a counterweight to China, but they're not so assured about the Southeast Asia move. And basically what they're focusing on is, how much more are we going to have to pay? And also, they are kind of indifferent to the economic dimension of the pivot and the TPP so far. And we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. So far it seems that those are some of the primary, aspects. And then, of course, in South Korea, the major focus, and I think in Japan, to a certain extent, the major focus has been on, the North Korean nuclear test. And in fact, what I felt in my visit to South Korea 2 weeks ago was that, interestingly enough, in contrast to Washington, where I think that the third nuclear test was so anticipated that it wasn't a surprise, in South Korea, and I think also in Japan to a certain extent, the third nuclear test actually was a bigger deal than the first or second nuclear test. I think that one reason for that is that it was more successful, and also because it is dawning on people that this is a threat that is here to stay. And that it really is going to involve the need to think through a response. And so what we saw, I think, over the course of the past few weeks in South Korea was a domestic debate about demands for the U.S. to return tactical nukes to South Korea. By the way, it's not going to happen. And accompanying that, more of a discussion about whether or not South Korea needs a nuclear capability. And in Japan, I think that what we saw was a more active discussion about strike capability. And so in both cases, I think that what that suggests is that the United States, with the North Korean nuclear test, has a bigger job on its hands in terms of providing assurances related to its extended deterrence commitments. And I would note that very quickly following that test, we saw President Obama on the phone with President Lee Myung-bak in the waning days of his administration, explicitly providing, that reassurance. But it seems that it's not enough necessarily to completely dampen at least the debate that's going on. I think that with, in the context of Japan, it's actually a double challenge, because we've got a need to provide reassurance on extended deterrence related to the North Korean nuclear threat, and there's the issue of assurances as related to Senkakus. And so, this is a challenging time, I think, both for the pivot and for, the alliances, I think, are essentially in good shape, but there are significant, challenges related to what is happening in North Korea in combination with the maritime issues that really are, I think, going to demand a good deal of time and attention. And I think one aspect of this that I think is worth thinking through is, okay, China is also involved in both of these cases in various ways. As the U.S. dialogue with China proceeds, how is it going to prioritize those two issues? Two very important security issues. And how we prioritize those issues may have some influence on outcomes, because frankly the Chinese leadership bandwidth for external affairs is actually pretty limited, really. I mean, if you start to look internally at China and the leadership transition, what you discover is that among the top 25 positions, there's no foreign affairs experts, okay? And so these, challenges to regional stability in Northeast Asia are coming at a time when actually all of the leaders have preoccupations with domestic issues, and that's going to make them even more difficult to resolve because we need leadership in the region. And so that brings me to Pak Geun-hye. She's been there a week, so I really don't have that much to say yet. But she did provide, I think, in the campaign, an interesting proposal that I think is, it bears close examination. And I think it was most clearly elaborated in a November op-ed in the Asian Wall Street Journal. But essentially it outlines her idea of a Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. And I think that what she did well was to identify the major challenges that the region faces and to provide a kind of vision for how some of those issues could be potentially dealt with. So there are three issues that she was concerned with in that piece. One is the possibility of US-China competition. And she very strongly came out in support of a strong US-China relationship, cooperation as the basis for addressing stability in Northeast Asia. Basically supporting Chinese-US efforts to build strategic trust. The second issue that she focused on was the history issue, and in her words, the need for Japan to take a correct view of history. And then, of course, the third one was the challenge of building a stable inter-Korean relationship. And so what I liked about the piece is that it did provide, I think, a vision for trying to address the three major challenges as she saw them. Of course, the challenge is that the heightening of tensions in all those areas creates a very adverse strategic environment for South Korea. Arguably, South Korea is one of the biggest losers from rising tensions in all these areas. But the other challenge, I think, to the achievement, the implementation of the vision that she laid out, especially with Japan and especially with North Korea, is that the vision actually requires action by the other party to be able to be achieved. And so it's very interesting because she's presented a vision, but as a politician, it's always dangerous to present a vision that relies on other people to be able to accomplish it. And I think that's essentially what she has done. So I don't know yet whether I think that the vision that she put forward in her Peace and Cooperation Initiative really is realistic or achievable, but I would simply note that it's there. One additional point that I wanted to make is related to actually the economic dimension of the project. And that is simply that, Japan and South Korea are where TPP and CJK meet. And how Japan and South Korea address their interests as they consider each of those agreements. I think it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. With regard to US-Japan, South Korea trilateralism, I simply would say that it's obviously very strongly in the U.S. interest to see greater defense cooperation in Northeast Asia. But it's also clear that the potential for that cooperation is bumping up against limits. And I think there are two limits that are most clear to me. One is the limit imposed by the difficulties in the Japan-South Korea relationship. And that gets us to territory, but it also gets us to the broader challenge of managing the relationship. the good news is that the Japan-Korea relationship has grown to be much more than territory or history, or comfort women, or any of those single issues. There's a lot more going on in the relationship that is very positive. Cultural exchange, tourism, frankly, the attitude personally, I think, of Japan's and Koreans toward each other, broadly speaking, despite the graph that Ueki-san showed, I think that reflects response to a particular event, but they're certainly sharing a lot of, how should we put it, tastes in terms of TV shows and, types of entertainment, et cetera. So I mean, it's not as though they're very, there's some commonalities. But, these other issues, I think, are issues that, frankly, they've got to, there's got to be a way of coming to terms with some of these issues that can provide a more sustainable relationship between the two countries because of the lost potential, I think, that could accompany not doing that. And that really, brings in the question of China. And so what I see with regard to U.S.-Japan-Korea trilateralism increasingly also is China trying to assert limits or take advantage of gaps among those three. And so I found it very interesting, for instance, that the South Korean foreign minister gave a speech at the UN General Assembly back in the fall where he mentioned the history issue, and Xinhua reported it as like breaking news. I don't think anybody else was really paying attention. And so that was quite striking to me. I think China's looking for opportunities in that regard. Another area where the Chinese, I think, are showing great sensitivity is related to extension of cooperation on missile defense to South Korea. And I think the third area is actually related to the possible regionalization of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And so we've seen now some very explicit public statements by people close to the Chinese government, indicating that, expanded missions for the U.S.-Korea alliance beyond deterring North Korea would be taken as evidence that it's targeted toward China. And so that's been signaled, as an area of sensitivity, and I think that is actually a kind of a new development. The Chinese hadn't paid that much attention to regionalization of issues in U.S.-Korea relationship until very recently. So those are the issues that I found most interesting. Obviously, in the panel, we've covered a lot of ground, and so it's pretty broad, but I'll close here and we can move on to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott, for your very informative analysis on the even bilateral and trilateral relations in Northeast Asia, with the sort of the implications of the pivot to the Northeast Asian relations as well. My very small probably question is actually related to your last point, trilateralism, again involving Japan and South Korea. But it seems to me this two bilateral relationship has been so much strained. Well, I'm not Korean especially, but as far as I just pursued Japanese media, well, still prospect is not necessarily so much right. And even President Park, the comment yesterday, I guess, on the colonial times, the Japanese crimes and etc., probably taking 1,000 years, 45 years or something like that. That simply indicates, of course, she tried to say this to the Korean people rather than carrying sort of the message to the Japanese people and government, but nevertheless, that was well captured again by Japanese media and people. So this is bottom line. It's true, strained relationship between Japan and South Korea. So in this case, how we can create trilateralism? Number one, China, Japan, Korea. And number two, China, Korea, and the United States. First one is on economics. Second one is on defense and security. First one is, just I mentioned at the beginning, China played a key role in bringing Japan and South Korea. It was actually China's role to persuade South Korea to join a trilateral FTA. And how about the United States' role in defense and security, the area? I think it was the United States' interest in forming a sort of the triangle, maybe softer defense cooperation. And suddenly, because of the strained relationship which I mentioned, probably it's quite difficult, if US didn't involve in bringing two countries targeting one specific, the common agenda or enemy to form that. So I'm curious enough, how US particularly will or might be involved in moving forward this trilateral security formula, particularly to target what China or North Korea or whatever. Okay, this is my question. Let's go. Right, we just finished the presentation time, and my watch says 20 minutes past. Okay. So we have, 11:20. 20 maybe minutes Q&A. So if you'd like to ask some questions to panelists, I think yesterday we requested people to come forward here to raise questions. So if you have brave enough, please. Okay, go ahead. And please identify yourself, your name or affiliation.
Thank you. My name is Julie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank all the panelists for very comprehensive, very in-depth presentations. Come back to the long peace and the sustainability and the global rules of law. 2 points I want to ask. All of you have mentioned the interconnectivity of all issues, because it has a lot to do with the maritime, the new global environment. So the focus on economy, where do you see ASEAN, Southeast Asia in the equation for the economy pictures of Japan, South Korea, US and China? And how does that get into the global pictures that can promote the trilateralism of US, Japan, and China, and Korea? I guess that probably we have to talk about 4 factors. We cannot put China out of the equation. So economy, and you talk about this TPP and all that, just in the pictures. The second one is the missile, the immediate threat, the nuclear problems. Do you see the connection between China and North Korea? There has been proven, there has been obvious signs and documents, data that China has been supporting North Korea in developing its nuclear missiles. And currently, I think there's concern that China has quickly improving its technology advances in the missile and the nuclear development. And what China has been helping North Korea with that. That has to do with the economy as well. So is there an area, a forum that Japan and South Korea can support each other, economy-wise and nuclear-wise? And what that has to do with the aviation, the ASC battle, the whole area in the Asia-Pacific Sea, air, and space. Would that be something that you can work on for the long term? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll try to accept maybe 2, 3 questions, then ask the speakers to answer.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the USJI Research Institute for a very nice and interesting program. I'm Mac Dessler from the University of Maryland. Professor Wiki talked about the long peace and the statement, which I believe to be true, that both the United States and Japan have been supporters both declaratory policy and, in fact, of Chinese economic success. The question, maybe it's a puzzle, maybe it's not a puzzle, is I'm not sure how many Chinese recognize this or think of this, or to the degree they think of this, how much it matters to them. I mean, objectively, this seems to be extraordinary, millions of orders of magnitude more important than the subcontinent islands, and yet, so I guess the question both is, and I know we don't have a panel of China experts here, but is there a way for the United States and Japan to sort of underscore, highlight what is in fact de facto continuing support for Chinese economic success, even though it obviously means a relative gains for China at the expense of both countries?
Thank you very much. Any other question? Okay, please.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Kwon. I'm an intern at the Korea Economic Institute. I apologize for my voice starts going away as well. I'm in the same boat as everyone seems. I wanted to ask a quick question, particularly on, I guess, recent events. There was a brief mention of sequestration before, and we at the KEI are particularly curious about the potential effects of sequestration and on readiness in USJI and USJI, and particularly since sequestration is also happening when the US budget is running still on FY12, and there has been no change whatsoever. And this leads to my sort of second question. When you say that the growing disillusionment among the Asian MMNAs, or non-NATO major allies, is warranted because, given the aforementioned question of the budget issues, but also because, as Mr. Snyder pointed out, and it's been pointed out at the Georgetown conference a couple of days ago on Wednesday, that the US government seems to be hand-handed in explaining the pivot and rebalancing at all, and that they do lack a comprehensive strategy altogether. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Antoine Roth. I'm a student at George Washington University. Professor Wiki, you mentioned that the Senkaku has become such a big problem, a big issue in domestic politics in China that makes the issue harder to resolve. What about the Japanese side, especially in connection to the China threat theory that has been growing in Japan? And so how do you see this, the Japanese domestic side, how does it impact the way this dispute could be resolved and how difficult it is to resolve? Thank you.
That's all right, no worries. You want to say? No? If you're right. No? Okay. Okay, all right. So this may be last.
Make the mic like me. All right. My name is Joel. That right there. Okay. My name is Joel Metcalf. I am from Waseda University. I just had a couple of questions regarding US, Japan, China, and Korea interactions with North Korea. Do you think that it is possible to restructure the six-party talks in some way that gives it a different meaning, or do you believe that economic sanctions are actually effective? And what do you think that China is able to do in regards to working together with, Japan, China, Korea, or Japan, Korea, and the U.S. Regarding North Korean nuclear tests? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. So, some of them quite difficult, I guess. Anyway, so let me ask Vic-san first, and maybe 4 or 5 minutes each.
Maybe I'll leave some of the economic questions to you or okay. Okay, thank you very much for your questions. And okay, on the first question about the, I'm going to defer to ASEAN because he's a specialist on ASEAN. But just very briefly, I think ASEAN is very important in the sense that it provides a core for the regional institutions. So obviously, it's important that I'm going to defer that to Professor Ted, I think. The Chinese support of the North Korea regime, I think, is pretty evident. I think China sees North Korea rather differently from other countries, meaning that it does provide a buffer to China, and it is a friendly state. No nuclear weapon in North Korea is going to be targeted against China. However, it is becoming slightly costly for China as well, but it's still propping up China because North Korea because it is worried about its regime collapsing. When Kim assumed the position, China sent a telegram congratulating his succession, and unlike the previous one, the four institutions congratulated, including a PLA, which didn't happen in the previous case, which is sort of an outright support for the new leadership. So obviously its stance is somewhat different. The second question of the importance of economic, how much does China realize this? I think that's a very good point, and I don't think United States and Japan should take that route. I'm not saying that the two countries should, but I think it may only be realized when there is sort of a crunch of the relations becoming sour, and that some of the benefit from the economic front gets to be felt. Meaning that some of the investment or trade being diminished. But at the moment, I think it is true that sort of the public sentiment, and even amongst the elite, is that China was successful in overcoming the world economic crisis, that hurt everybody else. So, they're pretty confident, and I think the public sort of thinks that as well. But recently, I met a few people who visited China, and they had some of the Chinese leadership mentioning the negative impacts on Chinese economy, which was something that he at least felt and was willing to address. He's one of the top leaders. So, the economic development is extremely important, and it's now no longer double-digit growth, but 7% slowing down. So when it slows down more, maybe it's felt. Some of the blogs are talking about, it's going to be hurting us as well, or even if we boycott the Japanese manufacturers, everybody else is maybe not buying Japanese cars, but they're starting to buy European cars, and nobody's really buying Chinese cars. So we're not really benefiting at all. So some of those things may be felt, but I think you're right that at the moment, I don't think it's really appreciated as much, which is kind of puzzled because 60% of the Chinese GDP is dependent on the trade, which is much higher than the numbers. Like in Japan, people think of it as a trading state, but it's only like 10 to 12, 15% of GDP is dependent on trade. Sequestration, I probably wouldn't refer to you. Japanese side. Interesting thing, in 1970, some of the defense officials wrote a paper and sort of identified some of the concerns, military or sort of security threats facing Japan, and there were two. One was a nuclear threat, and the other one was a threat to the offshore islands. So even as early as in the 1970s, these were the two things that were identified. During the Cold War, they were suppressed, meaning that they weren't felt as threats. But in 1992, when Chinese began and put the territorial waters, well, some of the military specialists immediately responded to that. Even in the 1987, when Vietnam and China had a clash, that it wasn't really noticed by many people, but the Maritime Self-Defense Force people noticed this and sort of made an implication to the change of behavior by China. So I think that the core element of Japan's China threat is to do with the offshore island issue. And of course, sort of reactions escalate. So at the moment, I think the public opinion on this issue is rather energized, and it's an emotional issue as well. And there are some elements that would rather want to keep it as such. And so, meaning the media and some of the, so I think it's at a stage that it's rather difficult to compromise. The 80-some% of the people in the public opinion, recent public opinions said that they support the Abe administration's handling of the issue, like the targeting of the fire control radar, and how it handled rather forcibly was one of the reasons why they supported Abe's government, which sort of indicates that the Japanese government is people are pretty much behind more, what's the word, resolute stance rather than conciliatory.
Great questions, very comprehensive. Let me try and tackle a couple of them real quickly, so we might be able to get some more. First off, on the North Korea-related questions, I'll defer or punt to Scott the six-part question, since I just follow what Scott says or react to what he says on North Korea in any event. But I will say on the question that you raised about the linkage between China and North Korea, you know, I think the bigger question isn't necessarily what China has been doing, but what it hasn't been doing. Because, yes, there is evidence that there are Chinese links to the missile and nuclear program, but to my knowledge, at least in the unclassified realm, there hasn't been definitive evidence that the Chinese government is facilitating this. In fact, I think it has an interest in not doing it. So rather, the stronger questions are, what will China be willing to take tougher actions to shut down the operations of North Korean entities inside North Korea? Will they be willing to put more restrictions on overflights, for example, between Pyongyang and Tehran? So the question is, what is China not doing other than what they are doing? Let's see. Mac, a little bit on your point about China, you know, just stepping back even beyond just the economic question, you know, I think it can be argued that one of the, I don't want to say failures, but one of the results of the way the rebalancing, the pivot was launched is that clearly it's put China on the defensive, and the Chinese are linking everything now to everything else around Asia, and that actually, of course, it's a security dilemma problem, right? So it just makes achieving the goals of the pivot much more difficult. You know, Secretary of State Kerry has come under some criticism for seeming to be, you know, too soft, according to some, on China. But another way to look at this is that, in a way, this could be an opportunity for a fresh start in terms of the symbolism of the relationship, so that the policy may not change. In other words, U.S. deployments to Australia are going to go forward. U.S. Taking a tough stance on the Central China and the South China Sea will likely continue, but perhaps it will be packaged in a softer way that's more palatable to the Chinese. Just speculating on that. You know, U.S.-China relations is always tacking between, you know, taking a harder line and a softer line, so they just be tacking back a little bit in that regard. Andrew, for the KI intern, just quick clarification that on the sequestration questions. I was just saying that these were questions that were being raised. I wasn't saying that people were despairing of the U.S. At all, but they were just questions, and I think they're legitimate ones, and obviously they won't be answered for some time. And then the question was raised about Japanese politics. Just a quick point to complement what Ueki-san said. Abe's rise, or his resurrection, is a direct result of China's actions on the Senkakus and South Korea's actions on Dokdo last summer. So if the Chinese and South Koreans are unhappy because of history and territorial reasons, then they, to a certain extent, they have no one but themselves to blame. And that's all because of the domestic reaction last summer to what's being seen among many Japanese, that they are being encircled in Asia by their neighbors, and therefore they're looking for a stronger leader on these issues.
A couple of questions about U.S.-Japan, Korea-U.S.-Japan trilateralism. I just wanted to point out some of the features that make it very challenging, because the U.S., I think, doesn't want to pursue U.S.-Japan, South Korea trilateralism as an overt balancing effort against China. But kind of using it to illustrate to China how North Korean provocations are disadvantageous to the broader security environment. I think that's maybe a too subtle point to try to make. It makes it really difficult, especially as we look at China-Japan-Korea cooperation, which is now institutionalized on the economic and functional side. And it begs the question of why is the U.S.-Japan-South Korea cooperation lagging seemingly in terms of institutionalization? And yet you have these sensitive strategic issues that seem to present some barrier to institutionalization. And I think one area where you could see greater cooperation that would be interesting actually would be on the extended deterrence discussion. Because we're having exactly the same discussion with Korea and Japan on extended deterrence, but we're trying to do it in parallel. There was just a U.S.-Korea defense discussion last week here in Washington, or 2 weeks ago, that was dealing with a lot of the same issues that we're dealing with separately in U.S.-Japan. So there's a lot of overlap. So there's interesting and complicated ways in which there are opportunities for synergy, but you also have to be concerned about signal. And that dilemma, I think, has not been effectively worked out or articulated. The other issue that I wanted to address is related to the U.S., Japan, China, South Korea cooperation on North Korea. The six-party talks as a format is not going to happen unless North Korea accepts denuclearization as an agenda for the talks. They're actually moving in the opposite direction. So I think where you see the most active cooperation right now among those other countries is actually the UN Security Council. But the UN Security Council resolution right now is also evidence of divisions within and among those countries. And so it's going to be a very complicated mix, I think, of competition and cooperation. Where there is, I think, greater opportunity potentially for all these parties to work together is actually more on the humanitarian and economic governance side related to North Korea. We all have a common interest in North Korea improving its internal standards of economic governance, but we have not yet found an effective mechanism that would draw us together. And just one additional comment on U.S.-China, a lot of the discussion related to North Korea had been centered on the six-party joint statement. But now that North Korea has publicly walked away from that joint statement, I think there's going to be a need for a refashioned understanding between the United States and China about what are our objectives regarding North Korea. I'm sorry I missed a couple of questions, but I think I should stop right there.
Well, thank you very much for also the speakers for kindly answering some of the questions and by audiences. Well, this is the sort of the end of the two-day seminar series, and with focus upon so-called CJK, and also implications of USJI payments. Again, well, just to summarize, well, of course, the number of complicated issues are raised by 6 speakers in total today and yesterday. I think that at least in security and economic trends, they have been actually interlinked quite complicatedly. And therefore, conflict, even corporations, these two items have been everywhere we can identify. But on the other hand, Northeast Asia does not necessarily have an institutional framework for dealing with these economic and even security terms. And this is probably something which most of the nations, Japan, China, even South Korea and the United States, should consider seriously. And that's why the second point, another linkage, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Again, we have institutions, ASEAN+3 or East Asian Summit, etc. But our point is, ASEAN way is a very consensus-based, very weak non-legal approaches. This is sort of the norm which this kind of regional institutions in East Asia, covering Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, continue to be supported. But I think the Americans and the pivot should be something which might change this kind of the approaches supported by the Southeast Asian or ASEAN. Otherwise, Southeast Asian-based institutions like APT or ARF or East Asian Summit may not be necessarily properly handling with such kind of complicated trend of linkages between economics and security in Northeast Asia. And finally, it is good news to most of the East Asian countries, especially South Korea and Japan. The United States has been recognizing this trend. And I think this is a sort of the strong rationale behind the Americans, the promotion of the Asian pivot. So again, as I asked in the beginning, how the new, the teams of the second administration of Obama, President Obama, will respond to it. It's a very, very significant issue. So therefore, as I mentioned, I tried to set up this kind of seminar in Washington, D.C. It's sort of the task for, I think, work sent back to the Waseda in March. And so I'm quite happy to hear that because it's not my solo role to write a report and etc. But I think Wexam will be making a huge contribution to writing, hopefully dominantly. Anyway, thank you very much for your, oh, luckily I don't have any water. Maritime. Anyway, thank you very much for your support and for these 2 seminars on 2 days. And I hope everyone who are interested in CJK are welcome to come back to the USJI seminars. And thank you very much.